"I know this is a shock, Mom, but Heather really needed this celebration," my son said as I stared at my empty savings account that had held $50,000 for my upcoming cancer treatments just yesterday. What Richard couldn't have anticipated was that my 40 years as a forensic accountant would help me not only trace exactly where every penny went, but also devise a perfectly legal plan that would ultimately expose his wife's years of financial manipulation and restore not just my medical fund, but also my relationship with my son who had been gradually stolen from me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Winters, and at 72 years old, I've learned that sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we've sacrificed the most to protect. I spent over 4 decades as a forensic accountant in Oakridge, a peaceful suburb of Minneapolis, where my late husband Robert built a successful family medical practice while we raised our only child, Richard. Our craftsman home on Maple Street wasn't grand, but it was filled with love and laughter. We hosted neighborhood barbecues in summer, carved pumpkins on our wide front porch every October, and built snow forts with the neighborhood children each winter. These traditions created a sense of belonging not just for our family but for our entire community. Robert and I believed that wealth wasn't measured by bank accounts, but by the strength of human connections. I can still picture Richard learning to ride his bicycle on our sloping driveway, Robert running alongside with one steady hand on the seat until that magical moment when our boy found his balance and pedaled forward on his own. The pride in Richard's eyes that day mirrored the pride in Robert's, a perfect circle of achievement and encouragement that I believed would define our family's relationships forever. Robert was never the stereotypical distant father that defined many men of his generation. Despite the demands of his medical practice, he coached Richard's Little League team, helped with science fair projects, and never missed a school concert or play. "Patients come and go," he often said, "but we only get one chance to raise our son, right?" This philosophy guided our parenting, creating what I thought was an unshakable foundation of trust and love between the three of us. My career in forensic accounting began quite by accident. After completing my business degree in 1973, I took what I believed would be a temporary bookkeeping position at Wilson & Associates while Robert completed his medical residency. The firm specialized in assisting businesses with financial irregularities and suspected fraud, a niche that was expanding as corporate financial systems grew more complex in the 1970s. 3 months into the job, I was reviewing financial statements for a small manufacturing company when I noticed subtle discrepancies in their accounts payable, patterns that didn't align with their business operations. After carefully documenting these irregularities, I presented my findings to Mr. Wilson. "Dorothy, this is remarkable work," he said after reviewing my analysis. "We've been looking at these statements for weeks and missed what you spotted in days." My attention to detail and natural skepticism proved valuable assets in financial investigation. While most people saw columns of numbers, I saw stories, narratives of human behavior revealed through financial patterns. A sudden change in purchasing habits might indicate a kickback scheme. Irregular cash deposits often revealed unreported income. Consistent transactions just below authorization thresholds frequently signaled someone circumventing internal controls. "You have an unusual gift for spotting patterns that others miss," Mr. Wilson told me after I had identified a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had eluded the firm's senior accountants. "Most people see financial statements and think they're just numbers on a page. You see the human behavior and motivations behind the transactions." What started as curiosity blossomed into genuine passion. By the time Robert had established his medical practice, I had earned my CPA certification and specialized training in forensic accounting. When Mr. Wilson decided to retire 15 years later, Robert and I took a considerable risk by purchasing the firm, renaming it Winters Financial Forensics. "Are you sure about this?" Robert had asked as we signed the bank loan documents. Running your own firm is a big responsibility to take on while raising Richard. I've never been more certain, I had replied, the weight of the decision balanced by the confidence of doing something I truly loved and excelled at. Besides, what better example for our son than seeing both his parents pursuing work they find meaningful? The business flourished under my management, expanding from small business investigations to complex financial fraud cases for government agencies and occasionally assisting in criminal prosecutions. Being a female forensic accountant in the 1970s and 80s presented numerous challenges: the skeptical looks from new clients, the dismissive attitudes from some male attorneys, the occasional refusal to have the little lady testify as an expert witness. But those obstacles only strengthened my resolve and sharpened my skills further. Richard grew up watching me overcome these prejudices, seeing firsthand how persistence and expertise could overcome social barriers. I had hoped these lessons would shape his character, teaching him to value substance over appearance and to recognize genuine capability, regardless of packaging. For many years, I believed they had. As a child, Richard showed remarkable interest in my work, often sitting beside me at my home office desk as I explained the patterns that revealed financial deception. By 12, he could identify basic inconsistencies in bank statements himself, understanding the principles of financial trails that most adults never grasp. His methodical mind and attention to detail served him well in school, particularly in mathematics and business studies. "He has your analytical intelligence," Robert observed one evening after helping Richard with a particularly challenging economics assignment, but applied to theoretical models instead of practical investigations. This aptitude eventually led Richard to pursue investment banking, rather than following either of his parents' career paths. After graduating from Northwestern with honors, he accepted a position with a Chicago financial firm, marking the beginning of his gradual drift from our close-knit family environment into a world that valued different metrics of success. His visits home became less frequent as his career advanced. Phone calls grew shorter and less personal. The detailed stories of his daily life that he had once shared freely became brief summaries focused primarily on professional achievements. Robert and I discussed this change between ourselves, but chose not to confront Richard directly, recognizing that establishing independence was both natural and necessary. "He needs to find his own path," Robert had reasoned during one of our conversations about the growing distance. "We raised him with solid values. They'll guide him even if we're not there reminding him of every principle." I had nodded in agreement, though something in my heart questioned whether the values of his new environment might eventually overwrite the foundations we had laid. The financial world Richard inhabited operated by different rules than our middle-class suburb, measuring worth in bonus structures and luxury possessions rather than community connections and personal integrity. When Robert was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 62, our carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The brilliant, compassionate man who had been my partner in everything faced a future of gradual cognitive decline. The diagnosis came just as I was considering retirement myself, immediately shifting all our priorities. Richard returned home immediately after the diagnosis, taking a 2-week leave from his firm to help during the initial shock and treatment planning. His presence during that difficult time reassured me that beneath the polished exterior of the successful investment banker, our son still carried the compassion and family loyalty we had instilled throughout his childhood. "What can I do?" he asked as we sat in the neurologist's office, reviewing treatment options and care plans. "Should I look into transferring to the Minneapolis office? Would that help?" The offer touched me deeply, though I encouraged him to maintain his career trajectory in Chicago. "Your father wouldn't want you to derail your professional progress," I insisted. "We'll manage his care, and you can visit when possible." But as Robert's condition stabilized into what would be a 7-year journey of gradual decline, Richard's Visits became increasingly brief and scheduled around business trips to Minneapolis rather than specifically to see his father. He called regularly, always asking about treatment progress and offering to help with expenses, which our insurance and savings fortunately covered, but the emotional presence I had hoped for remained limited. "He's doing his best in his own way," Robert defended him during a particularly difficult evening when Richard had cut short a weekend visit for an urgent client meeting that could have been handled by colleagues. Not everyone processes grief the same way. The cognitive decline was agonizingly slow at first. Misplaced items, repeated stories, occasional confusion about dates. Robert remained Robert in most ways, still funny and warm, still completely present in our relationship. We traveled while he was still able, visited Richard in Chicago several times, and maintained as many of our regular activities as possible. But the disease progressed relentlessly, eventually requiring in-home care, and finally full-time nursing assistance in our home. Through it all, I remained grateful that our careful financial planning allowed us to keep Robert at home rather than in a facility. A small mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. Robert passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in October, with me holding his hand as he took his final breaths in our home hospice setup. Richard arrived 5 hours later, having taken the first available flight from Chicago after my call. The genuine grief in his eyes when he saw his father's body reassured me that despite the physical and emotional distance he had maintained, the connection between them had remained meaningful. The funeral brought a large gathering of Robert's patients, colleagues, and friends, a testament to the lives he had touched throughout his career. Richard spoke beautifully about his father's influence on his life, sharing childhood memories and professional lessons that revealed a deeper appreciation for Robert's values than I had realized he still carried. Following Robert's death, Richard stayed for a full week, helping me navigate the initial paperwork and logistics that follow a spouse's passing. We spent several evenings reviewing family photo albums and sharing memories, conversations that momentarily bridged the gap that had grown between us. During those nights, I caught glimpses of the thoughtful, sensitive child who had once sat beside me at my desk, absorbing both technical skills and life lessons. Before returning to Chicago, Richard set up automatic bill payments for my utilities and subscribed me to a meal delivery service, practical solutions that reflected both genuine concern and his tendency to address emotional needs with logistical fixes. "Call me anytime, Mom," he said at the airport, embracing me tightly. "I can be on a plane within hours if you need anything." I nodded, appreciating the sincerity in his offer while recognizing that we defined need quite differently. His focus remained on practical emergencies, health crises, home repairs, financial concerns, while my deeper desire for regular connection and emotional presence went largely unaddressed. In the years following Robert's death, I worked to build a fulfilling life as a widow. I had sold my forensic accounting firm 2 years before Robert's diagnosis, though I maintained a small consulting practice where I occasionally assisted former clients with complex financial investigations. These projects kept my mind active while providing links to the professional identity that had defined much of my adult life. I volunteered at the community center teaching financial literacy to single mothers, joined a weekly bridge club at the local senior center, and tended the garden Robert and I had planted together. These activities provided structure and purpose, though nothing fully filled the space left by my husband's absence. Dr. Eleanor Chen, a recently retired oncologist, who had been one of Robert's colleagues during his practice, became my regular bridge partner and eventually a close friend. Her sharp mind and stories from her medical career reminded me of the satisfaction I had found in my own work, where solving financial puzzles often felt like diagnostic work of a different kind. "You would have made a good doctor, Dorothy," Eleanor told me one afternoon after I had spotted a subtle pattern in our opponent's bidding that allowed us to counter their strategy. "You see connections others miss, and you're methodical enough to follow evidence wherever it leads." Her observation made me smile, recognizing the same qualities that had made me successful as a forensic accountant. The ability to observe patterns, understand motivations, and recognize when something was out of place had served me well professionally and personally throughout my life. Richard maintained regular monthly calls during this period, usually on Sunday evenings, conversations that followed a predictable pattern. Brief inquiries about my health and activities, updates on his career advancement, and reminders of his availability should any emergency arise. He visited Minneapolis twice yearly, once during the winter holidays and again around my birthday in June. Short trips carefully scheduled around business obligations and vacation plans. During one such birthday visit 3 years after Robert's death, Richard seemed unusually distracted, checking his phone frequently and stepping away for calls multiple times during our dinner at my favorite local restaurant. When I gently inquired if everything was all right, he hesitated before responding. "Actually, Mom, I've been seeing someone," he admitted, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "It's fairly new, but significant." This revelation surprised me not, because Richard dated, he had mentioned various women casually over the years, but because he had never before described any relationship as significant. At 42, he had established patterns that suggested career would always take precedence over personal connections, making this development noteworthy. "Tell me about her," I encouraged, genuinely curious about who had managed to capture my son's closely guarded attention. "Her name is Heather Simmons," he replied, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen since his college years. "She works in client relations at Atlantic Financial. We met at an industry conference last year, but only started dating recently. She's brilliant, connected, understands my work in a way no one else ever has." The emphasis on professional compatibility raised subtle concerns, but I pushed them aside, focusing instead on my son's evident happiness. "She sounds wonderful. I'd love to meet her sometime." "Definitely," Richard promised, though he quickly steered the conversation back to safer territory: my garden renovations and his recent promotion to senior portfolio manager. 9 months passed before Heather's name resurfaced in our conversations, despite my occasional gentle inquiries. Then, in February, came the unexpected phone call that would ultimately lead to the empty savings account and the most shocking betrayal I had experienced since Robert's diagnosis. "Mom, I have amazing news." Richard's voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Heather and I are engaged." The announcement caught me completely off guard. In our monthly calls, he had mentioned Heather only sporadically, giving no indication that their relationship had progressed to such a significant level. Still, I responded with genuine happiness for my son, who had spent so many years prioritizing career over personal fulfillment. "That's wonderful, Richard. I'm so happy for you both. When do I get to meet my future daughter-in-law?" "Soon," he promised. "We're planning a May wedding, just a small ceremony at the Lakeside Club, nothing elaborate." The timeline startled me even more than the engagement itself. "May? This May? That's only 3 months away. We don't see any reason to—" "Wait," Richard explained, a defensive note entering his voice. "At our age, long engagements seem unnecessary. Heather is incredibly efficient. She's already securing vendors and handling most of the arrangements." I murmured appropriate congratulations while processing this information. Richard had always been methodical and deliberate in major decisions, often researching even minor purchases for weeks before committing. This sudden engagement and rushed wedding seemed entirely out of character, though I kept these thoughts to myself. "I'm looking forward to meeting her," I said instead. "Perhaps I could come to Chicago for a weekend soon?" "Let me check with Heather about our schedule," he replied, the slight hesitation in his voice triggering the faintest warning bell in my mind. "She's traveling a lot for work right now, and with wedding planning on top of that. But we'll definitely arrange something before May." That something didn't materialize until late March, just 8 weeks before the wedding date, when Richard called to say they would be visiting Minneapolis that weekend. Just a quick trip. We arrive Friday evening and leave Sunday morning. Heather has a client meeting in the city on Friday, so we thought we'd extend it to spend some time with you. I spent 2 days preparing for their visit, cleaning the house thoroughly, planning meals based on Richard's favorites, and even refreshing the guest room with new linens and spring flowers. The emotional investment in these preparations reflected not just maternal love, but a deeper hope that this relationship might reconnect me with my increasingly distant son. When they arrived Friday evening, my first impression of Heather was overwhelming. Tall, slender, and impeccably styled in designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly retirement income, she carried herself with the confident poise of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Her blonde hair was styled in an elegant bob that emphasized her striking bone structure and carefully applied makeup. "Dorothy," she greeted me, extending manicured hands rather than offering an embrace. "Richard has told me so much about you. It's finally nice to put a face to the name." Something in her tone, a subtle formality that created immediate distance, set off the same internal alert system that had served me well throughout my career when evaluating potentially fraudulent financial statements. The smile that accompanied her words seemed practiced rather than spontaneous, not quite reaching her eyes despite its technical perfection. As our weekend visit progressed, I noticed how Heather dominated conversations, redirecting topics whenever family history or personal connections arose. She showed remarkable interest in my home, commenting on its quaint charm, while asking surprisingly detailed questions about its value and my financial arrangements. When I mentioned Robert and how much he would have loved to see Richard married, she smoothly interjected with questions about local restaurants, effectively closing that emotional avenue. Even more concerning was Richard's behavior in her presence. My normally confident, articulate son seemed perpetually vigilant, watching Heather for subtle cues before speaking, deferring to her opinions on topics where he had previously held strong views, and repeatedly checking his phone whenever she stepped away. I was preparing to book my flight to Chicago for the wedding when I received news that changed everything. During a routine physical, my doctor discovered concerning test results that led to additional screenings and ultimately a diagnosis that I had dreaded since Robert's cancer scare 15 years earlier. Stage 2 breast cancer requiring immediate treatment. The estimated out-of-pocket costs would require accessing the special savings account I had maintained since selling my firm, funds I had preserved through Robert's illness specifically as my medical emergency reserve. When I called Richard to share the diagnosis, he offered support and financial assistance. I assured him my savings were adequate, approximately $50,000 set aside specifically for medical emergencies. What happened next would shatter not just my financial security, but my fundamental trust in my son, a betrayal that would require all my forensic skills to unravel and ultimately rectify through a form of justice I could never have anticipated. Me, the professional who had spent decades identifying when financial statements weren't functioning as represented, couldn't ignore the evidence before me. Something in this relationship was fundamentally misaligned, operating under pressure, rather than with the smooth interaction of well-matched partners. What I couldn't yet determine was whether this dysfunction stemmed from normal adjustment to a new relationship, or something more concerning. The investigative skills Eleanor had credited me with urged caution in jumping to conclusions without sufficient evidence, but the mother in me couldn't silence the persistent warning bells that had been ringing since I first met Heather Simmons. The weeks leading to the wedding brought increased distance rather than the connection I had hoped for. Richard's calls became briefer and less frequent, often with Heather audibly present in the background. The wedding details arrived via impersonal email from Heather's account, with detailed instructions about appropriate attire, navy or beige only, no bright colors, arrival times, and hotel booking information, all presented as non-negotiable, directives rather than friendly guidance. When I called Richard to ask if I might contribute to the ceremony in some way, perhaps sharing a special reading or family blessing, his response came after a muffled consultation with Heather. "The ceremony is already finalized," he explained, discomfort evident in his voice. "Heather has arranged everything with the officiant. But we appreciate the thought, Mom." I was preparing to book my flight to Chicago for the wedding when I received news that changed everything. During a routine physical, my doctor discovered concerning test results that led to additional screenings and ultimately a diagnosis that I had dreaded since Robert's cancer scare 15 years earlier, stage 2. Breast cancer requiring immediate treatment. "We've caught it relatively early," Dr. Jenkins assured me during our consultation. "With surgery and appropriate follow-up treatment, your prognosis is quite good. But we should move quickly. I'd like to schedule surgery within the next 3 weeks. The timing meant the procedure would fall just 1 week before Richard's wedding. More concerning were the financial implications. While my Medicare would cover much of the treatment, my supplemental insurance had a significant deductible and coverage limitations for certain treatments my oncologist recommended. The estimated out-of-pocket costs would require accessing the special savings account I had maintained since selling my firm, funds I had preserved through Robert's illness specifically as my medical emergency reserve. When I called Richard to share the diagnosis and explain that I might need to attend the wedding with certain physical limitations due to recent surgery, his initial response was appropriately concerned and supportive. "Mom, that's terrible news. Is there anything I can do? Do you need me to come to Minneapolis?" "No. That's not necessary right now," I assured him. "My friend Eleanor, you remember Dr. Chen, has offered to drive me to appointments and help post-surgery, but I wanted you to know that I might not be able to dance or participate in all the wedding activities. The surgery is scheduled for May 10th. "The wedding is May 17th, he said, concern evident in his voice. "Are you sure you should travel?" "At all. Maybe it would be better if you—" I heard Heather's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. Richard's tone shifted immediately. "Let me call you back, Mom. Heather and I need to discuss some options." When he called back an hour later, the suggestion was that I might consider postponing my surgery until after the wedding, a proposition that both my doctor and I found medically inadvisable. After some discussion, we agreed that I would proceed with treatment as scheduled, and Richard would arrange for a car service and special accommodations at the wedding to ensure my comfort. "And don't worry about the medical expenses, Mom," Richard added before ending our call. "If you need any financial help, just let me know. I want you to get the best care possible." His offer touched me deeply, not because I needed financial assistance, but because it represented genuine concern transcending the emotional distance that had grown between us. I assured him that my savings were adequate for the anticipated expenses, approximately $50,000 set aside specifically for medical emergencies. What happened next would shatter not just my financial security, but my fundamental trust in my son. A betrayal that would require all my forensic skills to unravel and ultimately rectify through a form of justice I could never have anticipated. 3 weeks after my cancer diagnosis, I sat in my oncologist's office reviewing treatment options. Dr. Sharma, a petite woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach I appreciated, had already explained the surgical procedure scheduled for the following week. Now we were discussing follow-up treatments and their associated costs. "With your particular cancer profile, I strongly recommend the targeted immunotherapy in addition to standard radiation," she explained, sliding a brochure across her desk. "It significantly reduces recurrence rates for patients in your situation." I nodded, having already researched this option extensively. "My supplemental insurance covers only about 30% of the immunotherapy costs, correct?" "Unfortunately, yes," Dr. Sharma confirmed. "Medicare and your supplement will cover the surgery and standard treatments almost completely, but the immunotherapy will require approximately $45,000 out of pocket. Some patients choose to forego it for financial reasons, but given Your otherwise excellent health and the aggressive nature of this particular cancer variant, I believe it offers substantial benefit. I understand, I assured her. Fortunately, I've maintained a medical emergency fund precisely for situations like this. Cost won't be a factor in my treatment decisions. The emergency fund had been a core principle Robert and I established early in our marriage. As a doctor, he had seen too many patients make medical decisions based on finances rather than optimal care. We'll always keep a cushion for health emergencies, he had insisted, even during leaner years when we were establishing our careers and paying for Richard's education. That discipline had served us well during Robert's illness, and now would ensure I received the best possible treatment for my cancer. The $50,000 in my dedicated medical savings account would cover the immunotherapy costs with a small margin for unexpected expenses, a buffer that provided not just financial security, but emotional peace during an already stressful situation. As I left Dr. Sharma's office with a folder of information and my surgery prep instructions, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and resolve. The diagnosis was frightening, but having concrete next steps and financial readiness created a path forward I could navigate methodically, much like approaching a complex financial investigation. At home that evening, I organized my medical documents with the same precision I had once applied to fraud cases. Creating a clear system would be essential for tracking treatments, insurance claims, and expenses in the coming months. I also prepared a detailed summary to share with Richard during our weekly call the following day, wanting to keep him informed without burdening him unnecessarily. When my phone rang Sunday evening, I was surprised to see not Richard's number, but an unfamiliar Chicago area code. Answering cautiously, I was greeted by Heather's precisely modulated voice. "Dorothy? It's Heather Simmons. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The unexpectedness of her call immediately heightened my awareness. In the month since Richard had announced their engagement, Heather had never once called me directly. "Not at all," I replied evenly. "I was actually expecting Richard's call." "That's why I'm calling," she explained, her tone reflecting practiced concern. "Richard asked me to let you know he's tied up with an emergency client situation and won't be able to make your regular call tonight. He sends his apologies and promises to call later this week." "I see," I responded, noting the lack of specific details, a pattern I recognized from my work identifying financial misrepresentations. "Is everything all right? This client emergency seems to be taking considerable time." A slight pause preceded her answer, another tell I'd learned to recognize when questioning witnesses about suspicious transactions. "It's quite complicated, but Richard is handling it brilliantly. Everyone at the firm is impressed with his leadership on this matter." The subtle emphasis on external validation was interesting, a common technique when deflecting from direct questions. Before I could probe further, Heather smoothly changed the subject. "I understand you received some concerning health news recently. Richard mentioned something about tests, though he was vague on details. Is everything all right?" The inquiry seemed genuinely concerned on the surface, but I noticed she used the opportunity to highlight Richard's lack of specific information, a detail that reinforced my sense that communication between my son and me was being carefully managed. "I was diagnosed with breast cancer," I stated directly, choosing not to soften the information. "Stage 2. Surgery is scheduled for next week, followed by radiation and targeted immunotherapy." I was planning to discuss the details with Richard tonight. "Oh my goodness!" Heather exclaimed, her surprise sounding rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "That's terrible news. No wonder Richard seemed distracted when he mentioned it. You must be so worried." The comment suggesting Richard had been vague about my diagnosis despite my detailed email to him last week nudged another warning bell in my mind. Either he hadn't read the email carefully, or Heather was manipulating the narrative. "I have excellent doctors and a clear treatment plan," I responded, maintaining the factual approach that had served me well professionally. And fortunately, I've maintained a dedicated medical fund that will cover the treatments not fully covered by insurance. How responsible, Heather remarked, something in her tone shifting subtly. Richard mentioned you've always been very organized financially. Approximately how much will these treatments cost? We want to make sure you're adequately prepared. The direct inquiry about specific amounts immediately triggered my professional caution. In forensic accounting, unusually specific questions about financial resources often preceded attempts to access those resources. The costs are substantial but manageable with my existing arrangements, I replied, deliberately avoiding the specific figure. Please tell Richard not to worry about the financial aspects. I'd appreciate if he could call me when he's available, though. I'd like to discuss the treatment timeline with him directly. Of course, Heather assured me. And Dorothy, please let us know if there's anything we can do to help. Perhaps you should consider coming to Chicago after your treatments, rather than trying to manage recovery alone. We could help arrange home care services. The suggestion of moving me to Chicago, away from my support network, medical team, and into their direct sphere of influence, raised yet another flag in my mental assessment. That's very thoughtful, I responded carefully. But my friend Eleanor, Dr. Chen, has already arranged a comprehensive support system here. My treatment team is at Minneapolis General, and continuity of care is important. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, we ended the call with Heather promising to have Richard contact me soon. As I set down the phone, I couldn't shake the sense that something significant had happened during that conversation. Something beyond the obvious, unusual circumstance of Heather calling in Richard's place. My professional instincts had been activated, the same alertness that had helped me identify fraudulent financial schemes for decades. The careful probing about my medical costs, the suggestion of relocating to Chicago, the management of information between Richard and me. Individually, each might have innocent explanations, but collectively they formed a pattern that warranted careful observation. 3 days passed without word from Richard, despite my follow-up text message asking him to call when convenient. This silence was unusual even by the standards of our often distant relationship. Finally, on Thursday morning, I received a brief text. Sorry for the delayed response, Mom. Extremely busy with work situation. We'll try to call this weekend. Don't worry about me missing the surgery. Already arranged for flowers to be delivered to the hospital. Take care. Love, R. The message struck me as oddly impersonal, lacking the specific details or questions about my condition that would reflect genuine engagement with my situation. The preemptive explanation for not attending the surgery, something I hadn't even requested, felt particularly strange given that Richard had flown home immediately for much less significant medical issues in the past. That evening, I did something I had never seriously considered before. I logged into my online banking to verify that my medical savings account was intact and secure. The dedicated account had been established at Robert's insistence when we sold my forensic accounting firm, separate from my regular checking and retirement accounts specifically to ensure medical emergencies would never compromise our financial security. When the account balance loaded on my screen, I initially thought there must be some technical error. Instead of the $50,000 that should have been there, the balance showed just $83.27. My first reaction was calm, methodical assessment, the professional response ingrained through decades of forensic work. I immediately checked the transaction history, discovering a wire transfer for $49,850 had been processed 2 days earlier. The transfer had been authorized using my online credentials, but had been initiated from an IP address in Chicago. The systematic analyst in me immediately began cataloging facts while suppressing the emotional response threatening to overwhelm my professional training. Someone had accessed my account without my knowledge. They had transferred nearly all funds to an external account. The access originated from Chicago, The timing coincided precisely with Heather's call inquiring about my medical costs. Richard had been unusually uncommunicative since that exact time frame. I printed the transaction details, then called the bank's fraud department. The representative was sympathetic, but not immediately helpful. "Mrs. Winters, I understand your concern, but the transfer was authorized using your correct credentials, security questions, and registered device. There were no fraud alerts triggered, because this appeared to be a legitimate transaction from a recognized user." "I did not make this transfer," I stated firmly, "and I've never accessed my accounts from Chicago. The device was registered to your account last month," the representative explained, checking her records. "On March 18th, to be precise, a new tablet was added to your authorized devices list after correctly answering your security questions." March 18th, the exact weekend Richard and Heather had visited Minneapolis. My mind flashed to a moment during their visit when I had left my purse in the living room while preparing dinner, with my phone and wallet inside. I had thought nothing of it at the time. "I want to file a formal fraud claim," I insisted. "This transfer was unauthorized, regardless of how it was executed." The representative took my information and explained the investigation process. Warning: it could take 7-10 business days before any determination would be made. Given the amount involved and the fact that the transaction appeared outwardly legitimate, she couldn't offer any guarantees. "In the meantime," she added gently, "you might want to discuss this with family members who might have access to your information. Many of these situations turn out to involve misunderstandings within families." Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the implication. In my years investigating financial fraud, I had seen plenty of cases where family members accessed accounts without explicit authorization, sometimes with benign intentions, often without them. After ending the call, I sat motionless at my kitchen table, allowing myself to process the emotional reality I had been professionally analyzing. My son, or more likely his fiancée with his knowledge, had stolen my cancer treatment fund. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Throughout Richard's childhood, Robert and I had emphasized financial responsibility and integrity. Richard had watched me investigate countless fraud cases, heard me discuss the devastating impact of financial exploitation on victims, and understood the moral principles that guided my professional work. How could he possibly justify taking money earmarked for life-saving medical treatment? Taking a deep breath, I made the direct call I should have made immediately. Richard's phone went straight to voicemail twice. On the third attempt, he finally answered, his voice tense. "Mom, I'm really in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" "No, Richard, you cannot call me back," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need you to explain why $49,850 was transferred from my medical savings account to an external account 2 days ago, initiated from Chicago using my credentials." The silence that followed was profound, the kind of revealing pause I had witnessed countless times when confronting financial fraudsters with unexpected evidence. When Richard finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, tension replaced by a carefully controlled calm. "I was going to call you about that tomorrow," he said, the rehearsed quality of his response unmistakable. "There's been a temporary reallocation of those funds for an urgent situation. I'll have everything back in your account before your treatments begin." The calculated language, temporary reallocation, rather than taking or borrowing, was classic minimization technique I had documented in dozens of fraud cases. The vague, urgent situation without specific details and the promise of future replacement were equally typical patterns of financial exploitation. "Richard, that money is for my cancer treatment," I stated firmly. "I need it returned immediately. Surgery is scheduled for next week, with deposits for the follow-up treatments due shortly after." Another pause, then. "Mom, I understand you're upset, but this is really a timing issue. Heather and I had an unexpected situation arise with our wedding venue. They required immediate payment to secure the date after another couple tried to outbid us. It was an emergency circumstance. The explanation was so shocking, I momentarily lost my professional composure. "You took my cancer treatment money for a wedding venue?" "Not just the venue," he corrected, as though this somehow improved the situation. "The caterer and entertainment deposits as well. The costs spiraled beyond our original budget because Heather's firm partners are attending, and appearances matter in our industry." I struggled to find words as Richard continued justifying the unjustifiable. "Listen, I've applied for a personal loan that will be approved next month. I'll replace everything with interest. You won't actually need the full amount until after the immunotherapy begins, which isn't for at least 2 months according to your treatment summary." The reference to my treatment summary, information I had shared privately with Richard via email, confirmed he had indeed read the detailed medical information I'd sent, despite Heather's implication otherwise. This deliberate misrepresentation reinforced my growing certainty that their actions were neither impulsive nor isolated, but part of a calculated pattern. "Richard, I need that money returned within 24 hours, I stated, the forensic accountant now fully overriding the wounded. "Mother, if it isn't, I will file criminal charges for financial exploitation and wire fraud, and I will contact your firm's ethics committee." "Mom!" he exclaimed, genuine alarm finally breaking through his controlled facade. "You can't be serious. This is a family matter, not a criminal one. I'm your son. And I'm a cancer patient whose treatment fund was stolen," I replied evenly. "Being family doesn't grant permission to take what isn't yours, especially when it's literally money for life-saving medical care. I know this is a shock, Mom, but Heather really needed this celebration," Richard said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that contrasted sharply with his earlier justifications. "Her position at the firm depends on maintaining certain social standards. This wedding is essentially a business investment for our future." The phrase struck me as so absurd, comparing a wedding celebration to my cancer treatment, that I nearly laughed despite the gravity of the situation. Instead, I maintained the clear boundaries that had served me well throughout my professional career. 24 hours, Richard. I expect confirmation of the wire transfer back to my account by this time tomorrow, or I will proceed with formal charges. This conversation is over. I ended the call before he could respond, my hand shaking with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Setting my phone aside, I realized the unexpected emotion was a strange sort of clarity, the kind that sometimes emerged during my most complex fraud investigations when disparate pieces suddenly formed a coherent picture. The call with Richard had revealed more than just the immediate theft. It had confirmed patterns I'd sensed but not fully integrated. His diminishing autonomy, Heather's careful management of our communication, the increasing emphasis on appearance over substance, and a fundamental shift in values that had occurred, so gradually, I hadn't recognized its completion. The son I had raised, the boy who had absorbed principles of integrity, responsibility, and genuine care for others, had been systematically replaced by someone who could rationalize stealing his mother's cancer treatment funds for a lavish party disguised as a business investment. This transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, I could trace its progression through subtle changes in Richard's communication, priorities, and decision-making over the years since he entered the financial industry. What began as simple distance had evolved into fundamentally different value systems, a shift accelerated and exploited by Heather's influence. As a forensic accountant, I had specialized in following money trails to uncover hidden relationships, motivations, and patterns of behavior. My professional instinct now was to apply these same skills to understanding exactly how my son had been transformed from the compassionate, principled person I had raised into someone capable of this betrayal. This wasn't just about recovering my stolen funds, though that remained an immediate practical necessity. It was about understanding the full scope of what appeared to be a systematic exploitation of my son and, by extension, my family's resources. Something told me the unauthorized transfer was merely the visible portion of a much larger pattern of financial manipulation. The analyst in me recognized that emotional confrontation would be counterproductive. Richard clearly believed his actions were justified within his current value framework, and direct moral appeals wouldn't penetrate the rationalizations he had constructed. Instead, I needed to approach this as I would any sophisticated financial fraud: gather comprehensive evidence, identify patterns, document the full scope of the situation, and develop a strategic response based on complete information rather than reactive emotion. My first priority was securing my medical treatment. Funds. For that immediate need, I called my friend Eleanor Chen, explaining the situation as factually as I could manage. "Dorothy, that's horrifying," Eleanor responded, her physician's pragmatism immediately focusing on solutions rather than outrage. "I have funds available I can loan you immediately. We can set up a formal agreement if you prefer, but there's no rush on repayment." "I appreciate that more than I can express," I told her, genuinely moved by her unhesitating offer. "I'm still hoping Richard will return the money tomorrow, but having a backup option means I won't need to delay treatment if he doesn't." "Have you considered filing a police report regardless?" Eleanor asked, her protective instincts evident. "This is elder financial exploitation, Dorothy. It's a serious crime, not just a family disagreement." "I'm evaluating all options," I replied carefully. "Right now, I'm focused on securing the necessary medical funds and gathering complete information before determining next steps." After arranging the potential loan details with Eleanor, I turned my full attention to understanding the broader situation. My years investigating complex financial schemes had taught me that visible transactions often represented just the tip of more extensive manipulation. If Richard and Heather had taken such a drastic step as accessing my medical fund, what else might they have done that I hadn't yet discovered? Starting with the most obvious question, I logged into my regular checking and savings accounts, relieved to find them untouched. My retirement accounts and investment portfolio similarly showed no unauthorized activities. The targeted nature of the theft, specifically taking the medical emergency fund while leaving other accounts untouched, suggested a calculated assessment of which funds could be accessed with minimal immediate consequence. Next, I pulled my credit reports from all 3 major bureaus, checking for any recently opened accounts or credit inquiries in my name. Finding nothing suspicious there provided some relief, though I immediately placed a security freeze on all 3 reports as a precautionary measure. As evening approached, I began a more comprehensive analysis of all communications with Richard and Heather over the past year. Retrieving emails, text messages, and notes from phone conversations, I created a timeline of their relationship development, financial discussions, behavioral changes, and significant decisions. Patterns emerged that I had sensed individually, but never connected systematically. Richard's communication had decreased dramatically since meeting Heather, with substantive conversations replaced by surface updates, questions about my financial arrangements had increased proportionally to decreasing personal engagement. The wedding timeline had been accelerated far beyond normal planning periods. Access to my home had been used to gather information rather than build connection. My cancer diagnosis had been followed immediately by inquiries about my financial resources rather than my medical concerns. These observations weren't merely disappointing. On a personal level, they matched patterns I had documented in numerous cases of systematic financial exploitation. The gradual isolation of the target, information gathering disguised as casual interest, creation of urgency to justify unusual financial requests, and minimization of concerns when questioned were textbook tactics I had helped prosecutors establish as evidence of premeditated financial fraud. The professional clarity of this analysis helped temper the personal devastation. This wasn't just my son making a terrible decision in a moment of poor judgment. The evidence suggested a calculated campaign that had been developing for months. possibly orchestrated primarily by Heather, but with Richard's increasing complicity. As midnight approached with no response from Richard, I made two decisions that would shape everything that followed. First, I accepted that the likelihood of voluntarily returned funds was minimal, meaning I would need to pursue formal remedies to secure my medical treatment financing. Second, and more significantly, I determined that this situation warranted a comprehensive investigation of Heather Simmons, the kind of deep background analysis I had conducted for major fraud cases throughout my career. If my professional instincts were correct, and they rarely misled me, Heather's influence over Richard represented a textbook case of financial exploitation through relationship manipulation. My forensic experience suggested such patterns rarely emerged spontaneously, but typically indicated a practiced methodology that had likely been deployed before. The next morning, with still no word from Richard, I made two calls. The first was to Eleanor, graciously accepting her loan offer to ensure my treatment could proceed as scheduled. The second was to Nathan Wilson, the son of my former mentor and now managing partner of the forensic accounting firm I had once owned. Nathan, I need a professional favor, I explained after brief pleasantries. I require a comprehensive background investigation on an individual named Heather Simmons, currently employed at Atlantic Financial in Chicago. I believe she may be engaged in a pattern of financial exploitation. Of course, Dorothy, he replied, without hesitation, the respect in his voice reflecting both our history and my continued standing in the field, despite retirement. Can I ask the context? Is this for a case you're consulting on? It's personal, I admitted. She's engaged to my son, and I have documented evidence suggesting she's manipulating him to access family assets, including stealing my cancer treatment fund. The brief silence conveyed Nathan's shock before his professional demeanor reasserted itself. I'm very sorry to hear that, Dorothy. We'll handle this with complete discretion and thoroughness. The firm still considers you family. There will be no charge for this service. With those arrangements in place and my treatment financing, secured through Eleanor's generosity, I turned to the immediate practical matter of my upcoming surgery. I had 5 days to prepare both physically and logistically, ensuring my home was ready for post-operative recovery, and all necessary arrangements were in place for follow-up care. Throughout those days, I maintained systematic documentation of all developments. Richard sent a single text message the day after our confrontation. Mom, I'm trying to arrange the funds return but facing unexpected complications. Need more time. Please don't do anything drastic. We'll explain everything after the wedding. Love, R. The message only reinforced my decision to proceed with formal remedies rather than relying on promises. I responded simply, I've secured alternative financing for my medical needs. We'll address this situation after my surgery. This measured response represented a strategic choice, providing Richard false confidence that I had stepped back from immediate action while I actually pursued a carefully planned investigation. My years in forensic accounting had taught me that maintaining an appearance of standard operations often yielded better evidence than alerting subjects to ongoing scrutiny. The day before my surgery, as I was completing final household preparations, I received an unexpected message from Heather. Dorothy, Richard mentioned your financial concerns, and I want to personally assure you that everything will be resolved after our wedding. This special day means so much to both of us, and we hope you'll still attend despite this temporary misunderstanding. Perhaps we can arrange a video call so you can participate virtually if you're not feeling well enough to travel. Best wishes for your procedure tomorrow. The calculated precision of this message, acknowledging the issue while minimizing its significance as a misunderstanding, emphasizing their wedding as the priority, and subtly discouraging my physical presence, crystallized my understanding of exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't merely opportunistic exploitation, but a sophisticated manipulation strategy I had seen employed in professional fraud schemes. I didn't respond to Heather's message, maintaining information control, while completing my surgery preparations. The investigation I had initiated through Nathan would require time to develop comprehensive results, and my immediate priority remained focusing on my medical treatment and recovery. The morning of surgery, I was surprised to receive a large flower arrangement delivered to my hospital room. The accompanying card read simply, "Wishing you a successful procedure and quick recovery, Richard and Heather." The nurse who brought them in smiled. "Your son must be very concerned. He called the nursing station twice this morning checking on your arrival and room assignment." The flowers and calls represented a calculated public display of concern, creating visible evidence of familial care while simultaneously taking no meaningful supportive action. It was a pattern I had documented in financial exploitation cases where perpetrators maintained appearances of proper relationship while systematically abusing trust. As I was wheeled into surgery later that morning, my thoughts weren't focused on cancer or medical concerns, but rather on the investigation I had set in motion. Something told me Nathan's team would uncover information that would prove crucial, not just for recovering my stolen funds, but for understanding the full scope of what my son had become involved in. The anesthesiologist asked me to count backward from 10 as the medication entered my system. As consciousness began to fade, I found myself thinking not as a worried mother, but as the methodical forensic accountant I had been for over 40 years. Someone had made a serious miscalculation in targeting me, specifically underestimating both my investigative capabilities and my determination to uncover financial deception, regardless of who perpetrated it. My last thought before drifting into unconsciousness was surprisingly clear. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money. This was about exposing a predator who had targeted my family, and unlike many victims of such schemes, I possessed both the professional skills and resources to ensure that exposure would be comprehensive, irrefutable, and devastating in its consequences. I awoke from surgery disoriented, but alert enough to recognize Eleanor's familiar face beside my hospital bed. The procedure had gone well, according to my surgeon. Clean margins around the tumor and no immediate evidence of spread to the lymph nodes. While full pathology results would take several days, the initial prognosis was as positive as could be expected under the circumstances. "Welcome back," Eleanor said, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. "Dr. Morris says everything went perfectly. He removed the entire tumor with excellent margins." I managed a weak smile, still fighting the effects of anesthesia. "Any word from Richard?" Eleanor's expression tightened slightly. "He called the nurses' station twice asking for updates but hasn't come to the hospital. The flowers are nice, though," she added, gesturing toward the elaborate arrangement from Richard and Heather that now sat on the windowsill. The conspicuous display of concern without actual presence confirmed my assessment of their calculated approach, maintaining appearances while continuing their wedding preparations uninterrupted. In my professional experience, this pattern of symbolic gestures without substantive support was characteristic of individuals maintaining a facade of propriety while engaging in exploitative behavior. "How are you feeling about everything?" Eleanor asked carefully, her question encompassing far more than my physical recovery. "I'm thinking clearly," I assured her. "Surgery hasn't changed my assessment of the situation or my determination to address it properly." Eleanor nodded, having known me long enough to recognize when I had fully engaged my analytical faculties. "Nathan Wilson called while you were in surgery," she informed me. "He didn't leave specific details but asked me to tell you they're making significant progress and will have preliminary findings by tomorrow." This news provided more immediate relief than the positive surgical outcome. Nathan's team was among the best in financial forensics, and significant progress. This quickly suggested they had indeed found noteworthy information about Heather Simmons. My hospital stay lasted just 2 nights, standard protocol for my type of lumpectomy procedure. Throughout this time, Richard maintained his pattern of performative concern, calling the nurse's station daily for updates, but never visiting despite being just a 5-hour drive away in Chicago. The wedding preparations apparently took precedence over his mother's cancer surgery, a priority alignment that spoke volumes about Heather's influence and Richard's compromised values. Eleanor drove me home on the third day, having arranged a rotating schedule of friends who would check on me regularly during my initial recovery period. My physical discomfort was manageable with prescribed medication, leaving my mind remarkably clear and focused on the investigation I had initiated. Late that afternoon, as I was settling into my recovery routine at home, my phone rang with Nathan. Wilson's number. "Dorothy, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," he began. "Eleanor mentioned you were being discharged today." "Your timing is perfect," I assured him. "I'm comfortable and very interested in your findings." "I'd prefer to discuss this in person given the sensitive nature of the information," Nathan replied, his tone confirming my suspicion that his team had uncovered significant concerns. "Would tomorrow morning be too soon? I could come to your home around 10 if that's convenient." "That would be ideal," I confirmed, appreciating both his discretion and his willingness to accommodate my recovery. "I'm eager to hear what you've found." After ending the call, I received a text message from Richard. "Heard you're home from hospital. Hope recovery is going well. Very busy with final wedding arrangements. We'll try to call soon." The brevity and timing, coming weeks after clearing out my medical fund, but only after I was safely through surgery, reinforced the pattern of minimal engagement focused on maintaining appearances rather than providing genuine support. I chose not to respond, maintaining information control while awaiting Nathan's report. The following morning, precisely at 10, Nathan arrived carrying both a briefcase and a bakery box. "My mother insisted I bring her cranberry orange scones," he explained with a smile that momentarily softened his otherwise serious demeanor. "She sends her best wishes for your recovery." Margaret Wilson's thoughtfulness touched me. She and I had become friends when our husbands were business partners decades ago, and though we saw each other less frequently since retirement, the connection remained meaningful. "Please thank her for me," I responded as we settled in my living room with coffee and the homemade scones. Once seated, Nathan's expression shifted to the focused professional intensity I recognized from his father, the look of a forensic specialist preparing to present troubling findings. He opened his briefcase and removed a bound report with the Wilson Financial Forensics logo embossed on its cover. "Dorothy, I want to begin by saying this investigation yielded more significant findings than we anticipated," he stated, his tone measured but grave. What began as a background check on Heather Simmons revealed patterns that warranted deeper examination. With your permission, we expanded our scope to include her financial activities, professional history, and previous relationships. "I appreciate your thoroughness," I acknowledged, recognizing that Nathan had gone beyond my initial request based on professional concern rather than mere curiosity. "To summarize our key findings," he continued, opening the report to a tabbed executive summary page, "Heather Simmons is not who she presents herself to be. Her actual name is Helena Sullivan. She has changed her identity 3 times in the past decade, each time following a similar pattern of relationship formation with financially established professionals, followed by systematic financial extraction, through various means. Though I had suspected something significant, the confirmation of a serial pattern exceeded even my professional suspicions." "Previous targets?" I asked, automatically shifting into the analytical mindset that had characterized my career. "We've identified 3 definitive cases and 2 probable ones," Nathan replied, turning to a detailed timeline in the report. The most recent confirmed case before Richard involved a neurosurgeon in Boston named Dr. James Harrington. Their relationship followed a remarkably similar trajectory: meeting at a professional conference, whirlwind romance, accelerated engagement, and wedding planning that coincided with increasingly problematic financial entanglements. "What was the outcome in that case?" I asked, noting the methodical patterns that matched what I had observed with Richard. Dr. Harrington discovered unauthorized transfers from his accounts approximately 2 weeks before their scheduled wedding. When confronted, Helena, using the name Helen Stewart at that time, disappeared with approximately $320,000 from various accounts. She had also accumulated nearly $90,000 in credit card debt in their joint names. The scale of the financial exploitation was sobering, though not entirely surprising given the calculated approach I had witnessed. "Criminal charges?" I inquired, already thinking about potential remedies for my own situation. "Filed but never prosecuted," Nathan explained. She disappeared effectively, changing her identity again before resurfacing in Chicago with altered appearance and documentation. Dr. Harrington eventually dropped the charges after his legal team advised him of the difficulties in pursuing someone who had essentially vanished. Nathan continued through the other cases, each following similar patterns with variations tailored to the specific victim's vulnerabilities. A technology executive in Seattle had lost approximately $275,000 through a combination of direct theft and fraudulent investment schemes before his fiancée, Amanda Phillips, disappeared weeks before their wedding. A recently widowed financial advisor in San Francisco had lost his late wife's life insurance payout of $180,000 to Catherine Morgan, who had created a fictional health crisis requiring immediate funds before vanishing. The consistent methodology suggests a professional operation rather than opportunistic fraud, Nathan observed, confirming my own assessment. Her approach has become more sophisticated with each iteration. The current identity as Heather Simmons has been meticulously constructed with high-quality documentation and a carefully crafted professional history at Atlantic Financial. "Is the position at Atlantic legitimate?" I asked, wondering about the extent of the deception. "Yes and no," Nathan replied. "She is employed there, but not in the senior client relations role she claims. She's actually in an administrative support position with limited client contact. However, she's leveraged that position to access information about wealthy clients and potential targets. Our source at the firm indicated she's particularly skilled at identifying men with substantial assets and minimal family connections." The calculated predation described in Nathan's report crystallized my understanding of Richard's situation. He hadn't simply made poor relationship choices or fallen under the influence of someone with different values. He had been specifically targeted by a sophisticated financial predator with a documented history of similar exploitations. "What about her current financial activities?" I asked, focusing on the immediate concerns related to Richard. Nathan turned to another section of the report. "This is where things become particularly concerning for your son's situation. Based on financial records we were able to access, Heather Helena has already established multiple accounts in offshore jurisdictions. Small but consistent transfers have been moving funds from accounts she shares with Richard to these offshore holdings over the past 7 months, totaling approximately $175,000 to date. The systematic extraction of my son's assets paralleled the patterns documented in previous cases, suggesting we were witnessing the middle stage of Helena's established methodology rather than the beginning or end. The timeline indicated Richard likely had weeks, not months, before she would complete her financial exploitation and disappear, probably during their honeymoon when she would have maximal access to his accounts with minimal oversight. "The wedding is scheduled for next Saturday," I noted, mentally calculating the likely timetable based on previous cases. "That gives us very little time to intervene effectively." "There's one additional complication," Nathan added, turning to the final section of his report. "Helena Sullivan is technically still married to her first husband, James Collins, making her current identity not just fraudulent, but her planned marriage to Richard legally invalid as well. She never filed divorce papers before disappearing and creating her subsequent identities. This legal dimension added another layer to an already complex situation. Beyond the financial fraud, Helena was now potentially committing marriage fraud as well, a federal offense with significant penalties. "Nathan, I can't thank you enough for this thorough investigation," I said, genuinely impressed by the comprehensive analysis his team had assembled in just days. "This gives me critical information for determining next steps. I should mention," he added as he prepared to leave, "that all findings in this report have been thoroughly documented and could be submitted to law enforcement if you choose to pursue that option. We've maintained proper chain of custody for all evidence and followed all legal requirements for financial investigations." After Nathan departed, I spent the afternoon reviewing the detailed report while considering my options. The comprehensive evidence presented clear choices, each with significant implications. Contact law enforcement immediately with evidence of Helena's multiple frauds. Confront Richard directly with the evidence and attempt to extract him from the relationship approach. Helena privately with evidence of her previous identities and negotiate return of stolen funds, allow events to proceed while documenting additional evidence, potentially catching her in the act of larger fraud. Each approach carried both advantages and risks. Immediate law enforcement involvement would likely prevent further financial losses, but might create legal complications for Richard if he had unknowingly participated in any fraudulent activities. Direct confrontation with Richard risked Helena, accelerating her timeline or manipulating him into dismissing the evidence. Approaching Helena directly might recover immediate funds, but would alert her to detection before securing comprehensive evidence of her activities. As I weighed these options, my phone chimed with a text message from Richard. "Wedding week officially begins. Rehearsal dinner. Friday 7 p.m., ceremony Saturday 2 p.m. Heather has arranged for a car service to bring you from hotel to venue so you won't need to worry about driving while recovering. Can't wait to see you. Love, R." The cheerful tone contrasted sharply with the reality of the situation. My son excitedly preparing to marry a serial fraud who had already stolen his mother's cancer treatment funds and systematically extracted hundreds of thousands from his accounts. The disconnect between appearance and reality reminded me of numerous fraud cases I had investigated, where maintaining normal operations often served as cover for ongoing financial crimes. My professional experience suggested that the most effective approach to sophisticated fraud was rarely direct confrontation, but rather strategic intervention at critical vulnerability points. Helena's methodology relied on maintaining control of information flow and timing, particularly accelerating the wedding timeline to prevent thorough due diligence while delaying any financial accounting until after legalities were completed. What she couldn't have anticipated was encountering a forensic accounting specialist who understood financial fraud patterns intimately. My decades investigating complex schemes had taught me that the most successful interventions required three elements: comprehensive evidence, strategic timing, and leveraging the perpetrator's own methodology against them. With Nathan's report, providing the comprehensive evidence, I needed to determine the optimal timing and approach for intervention that would both protect Richard and ensure recovery of stolen assets. Direct confrontation with either Richard or Helena before securing the funds would likely be counterproductive, potentially causing Helena to accelerate her disappearance timeline with whatever assets she had already secured. After careful consideration, I developed a strategy that leveraged my professional expertise while accounting for the emotional complexities of family involvement. The approach would require precise timing, careful documentation, and coordinating multiple elements simultaneously, skills I had honed throughout my career investigating sophisticated financial schemes. First, I called Eleanor to discuss my physical ability to travel to Chicago the following week. As both a physician and friend, she was uniquely positioned to advise on managing my post-surgical recovery during necessary travel. Medically speaking, you should be cleared for travel by Thursday if your recovery continues as expected, she advised. But Dorothy, are you sure confronting them at the wedding is the best approach? The emotional stress alone could compromise your recovery. I'm not planning a dramatic wedding objection, I assured her. My approach will be methodical and controlled, exactly as I would handle any complex fraud case. The timing is simply dictated by Helena's established patterns in previous cases. Next, I contacted Nathan Wilson again to discuss specific elements of my planned intervention, requiring both his professional expertise and potential presence in Chicago. I'd be happy to assist personally, he confirmed after hearing my proposed approach. This case concerns me not just professionally, but as someone whose family has known yours for decades. We can have the necessary documentation prepared by Thursday and coordinate with the appropriate authorities as you've outlined. With these foundational elements in place, I made one final call that evening to the fraud department at Richard's investment firm, requesting a confidential meeting with their compliance officer the following week in Chicago. My reputation in the forensic accounting field secured the meeting without requiring detailed explanation of my concerns beyond mentioning potential identity fraud involving an employee's fiancé. The pieces of my strategic response were falling into place, but I needed to maintain normal communications with Richard to prevent arousing suspicion. I responded to his wedding week text with appropriate enthusiasm, confirming my travel plans and expressing excitement to see him. Technically true, though not for the reasons he assumed. Over the next few days, as my physical recovery progressed, steadily, I methodically prepared for what would become the most important financial intervention of my career. This wasn't merely a professional case. It involved my son's future and our family's resources. But the principles of effective fraud intervention remained consistent regardless of personal involvement. Richard called midweek. His conversation, filled with wedding details and logistical updates, but notably lacking any mention of my medical condition or the stolen funds. His compartmentalization suggested Helena's influence had trained him to separate these aspects completely, discussing wedding arrangements as though stealing his mother's cancer treatment money was entirely unrelated. The room block at the Deed Hotel is confirmed, he informed me, his tone suggesting this represented considerate planning rather than basic courtesy. Heather has arranged a beautiful suite for you with a view of the lake. The car service will pick you up Friday afternoon to bring you to the rehearsal dinner. That sounds lovely, I responded, matching his tone while noting the continued absence of any financial discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing everything you've planned. Heather has created something really special, he continued enthusiastically. Her attention to detail is amazing. She's thought of everything from custom cocktails to personalized welcome bags for guests. Her firm's partners have been incredibly supportive, offering their club memberships and vacation properties for different events. The emphasis on external validation and luxury elements aligned perfectly with Helena's documented methodology in previous cases, creating a facade of sophistication and connection that impressed the target while justifying extraordinary expenses that ultimately served her extraction timeline rather than building a genuine shared future. I maintained appropriate responses throughout the conversation, while internally documenting each element that matched patterns from Nathan's report. When Richard eventually asked about my recovery, the question felt perfunctory, a brief acknowledgement before returning to wedding details rather than genuine concern about my medical condition. Everything is progressing well, I assured him, providing minimal details. I'll be fully capable of traveling and participating in the wedding activities as planned. By Thursday morning, my surgical recovery had advanced sufficiently for travel, just as Eleanor had predicted. I packed carefully for the Chicago trip, including not just appropriate wedding attire but also the comprehensive documentation from Nathan's investigation and additional materials I had prepared for my planned intervention. As I prepared to leave, for the airport, I received an unexpected call from Nathan Wilson. "Dorothy, we've uncovered some significant new information that might affect your timeline," he began, his tone conveying the urgency of his findings. "Helena appears to be accelerating her extraction schedule. There was a substantial wire transfer from Richard's investment account to an offshore holding yesterday, Approximately $320,000 moved to a Cayman Islands account, registered to a shell company we've linked to her previous identity. This development confirmed my suspicion that Helena was entering the final phase of her established pattern, maximizing financial extraction immediately before disappearing. The substantial transfer suggested she might be planning to vanish, even sooner than the post-wedding timeline I had anticipated. "Has she purchased travel documents that might indicate her departure plans?" I asked, immediately focusing on the operational implications. "Yes," Nathan confirmed. 2 one-way first-class tickets to Belize departing Sunday morning, the day after the wedding. Only they're not in Richard's name as we would expect for a honeymoon. The second ticket is registered to a James Mercer, who we've identified as a periodic associate in at least 2 of her previous operations. The verification of an accomplice and specific exit strategy crystallized the urgency of my intervention. Helena wasn't planning a honeymoon with Richard, but rather an escape with her associate, likely leaving my son not just financially devastated, but potentially implicated in whatever fraudulent activities had generated the funds she had extracted. "I'm adjusting my timeline accordingly," I informed Nathan. "Please meet me at the Chicago Grand Hotel at 4 p.m. today rather than tomorrow morning as originally planned. We'll need to coordinate with the firm's compliance office immediately rather than waiting until after the rehearsal dinner." "I'll make the necessary arrangements," Nathan assured me. "We'll be ready to proceed as soon as you arrive." As I drove to the airport, I reflected on how this situation embodied the core principles I had applied throughout my forensic accounting career: meticulous evidence gathering, strategic timing, and understanding that financial criminals typically follow recognizable patterns even when they believe their schemes are uniquely crafted. Helena Sullivan, currently operating as Heather Simmons, had successfully executed her methodology multiple times, refining her approach with each iteration. What she couldn't have anticipated was targeting a family that included someone with extensive experience documenting and intervening in precisely the type of financial fraud she specialized in. The mother whose cancer treatment funds she had stolen wasn't just any victim, but a retired forensic accounting specialist with 4 decades of experience investigating complex financial crimes. The widow she had dismissed as an easy secondary target after capturing her son's trust was actually a seasoned financial investigator with extensive professional resources and methodologies for uncovering exactly the type of fraud Helena had built her life around. As my flight took off toward Chicago, I reviewed the detailed intervention plan I had developed. This wouldn't be an emotional confrontation or dramatic wedding objection, but rather a precisely orchestrated financial fraud intervention executed with the same professional thoroughness I had applied to cases throughout my career. Helena Sullivan had made a fundamental miscalculation in targeting my family, assuming that a 72-year-old widow receiving a cancer diagnosis would be too vulnerable, distracted, and emotionally overwhelmed to recognize and respond effectively to sophisticated financial fraud. That miscalculation would prove the undoing of her entire operation. My phone chimed with a final text message from Richard before the flight attendant requested airplane mode. "Safe travels, Mom. Just 48 hours until the big day. Heather can't wait to officially become part of the family." The irony of his enthusiasm was profound, given what I now knew. In less than 24 hours, Helena Sullivan's carefully constructed deception would begin unraveling, not through dramatic accusation, but through the methodical financial forensics that had defined my professional life. The flight to Chicago gave me time to review the detailed evidence Nathan had assembled and finalize my intervention strategy. By the time we began our descent, I had mentally transitioned fully from concerned mother to forensic specialist, the role in which I had spent most of my adult life, and the expertise that would prove crucial in saving my son from a predator who had already successfully exploited multiple victims before him. As the plane touched down in Chicago, I felt a surprising sense of calm determination. Cancer had threatened my health, but Helena Sullivan had threatened something equally precious: my son's future and our family's trust. The skills I had developed throughout my career had prepared me perfectly for addressing this threat with precision, evidence, and strategic intervention rather than emotional reaction. Helena might have been counting on dealing with a vulnerable cancer patient, but she was about to encounter the forensic accountant instead, and that professional identity had never backed down from exposing financial fraud, regardless of how sophisticated the perpetrator believed their scheme to be. My taxi pulled up to the Chicago Grand Hotel precisely at 3:45 p.m., allowing me to arrive at our meeting point ahead of schedule, a professional habit ingrained through decades of court appointments and client consultations. The elegant lobby with its marble columns and crystal chandeliers provided a fitting backdrop for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal confrontation in my son's life. Nathan Wilson was already waiting, his tall figure easily recognizable despite the 5 years since our last in-person meeting. He stood as I approached, his expression reflecting both professional composure and personal concern. "Dorothy, you're looking remarkably well considering your recent surgery," he greeted me, helping with my small suitcase. "Are you certain you're up for what's ahead? We could modify our approach if needed." "I'm perfectly capable," I assured him, appreciating his concern but unwilling to compromise our carefully structured intervention. Some discomfort is a small price for preventing what would otherwise be a devastating outcome for Richard. We settled in a quiet corner of the lobby bar, strategically selected to provide privacy while maintaining visibility of the main entrance. According to Richard's itinerary, he and Helena would be arriving around 5:30 p.m. to check in before the rehearsal dinner preparations began at the hotel's grand ballroom. The compliance officers from Wellington Investment Partners will meet us here at 4:30, Nathan informed me, referring to Richard's firm. "I've briefed them on the essential elements without revealing all details as you suggested. They're taking this very seriously, particularly given the potential implications for client accounts Richard manages." "And the other arrangements?" I asked, mentally checking off the components of our coordinated response. "All in place," Nathan confirmed. "Detective Lawson from Financial Crimes will join us at 5 p.m. He's bringing the documentation from the Boston and Seattle cases, along with formal identification confirmation from their fraud units. The prosecutor has reviewed our evidence and approved the approach we discussed, with the caveat that timing will be critical." I nodded, acknowledging both the complexities and necessities of our plan. Unlike emotional confrontations that might drive Helena to accelerate her disappearance, our approach leveraged legal and financial constraints that would be difficult to evade. By coordinating with multiple authorities simultaneously, we would effectively close the escape routes she had successfully used in previous cases. "What about Richard's accounts?" I asked, focusing on the immediate financial protection that remained. "A primary concern. As you requested, we haven't frozen anything yet to avoid alerting her," Nathan explained. "But I've prepared the documentation for immediate account restrictions once we begin the formal intervention. The compliance team will implement those controls as soon as they verify our evidence." At precisely 4:30 p.m., 2 professionally dressed individuals approached our table, a silver-haired man in his 60s and a younger woman whose attentive gaze suggested the sharp analytical mind essential in financial compliance work. "Mrs. Winters? I'm Howard Brennan, head of compliance at Wellington." The man introduced himself with a firm handshake. "This is Jennifer Martinez, our Deputy Director of Security and Fraud Prevention." "Thank you for meeting on such short notice," I responded, appreciating their prompt engagement. "I understand the sensitivity of what we're discussing, particularly given my son's position at your firm." "Richard is a valued senior portfolio manager," Howard acknowledged, his tone measured, "which makes these concerns all the more significant. We take any potential fraud risks seriously, especially those that might affect client accounts or firm reputation." Nathan efficiently distributed copies of the executive summary from his investigation, a carefully crafted 5-page document that outlined Helena Sullivan's identity fraud, previous financial schemes, and current activities involving Richard's accounts without overwhelming with excessive detail. As they reviewed the document, Jennifer Martinez's expression shifted from professional neutrality to focused concern. These offshore transfers from Mr. Winters' personal accounts, they follow patterns we're trained to flag as potential money laundering structures, she noted, highlighting specific transaction sequences. Has he authorized these movements? Based on our conversations, he appears unaware of their full extent, I explained. Helena has been systematically isolating him from external perspectives while establishing joint access to his accounts. The pattern matches her previous operations almost exactly. Howard Brennan looked up from the report, his expression grave. If even half of this is verified, we're potentially looking at criminal exposure for the firm if client funds have been compromised. Has she accessed any of the portfolios Richard manages? No evidence of client account tampering yet, Nathan confirmed. But given the acceleration of personal account transfers, it represents a significant risk, particularly with the Sunday morning flight reservations suggesting imminent departure. Both compliance officers nodded, their expressions reflecting the seriousness with which financial institutions view potential fraud exposure. Howard made a brief call, speaking in the professional shorthand of someone activating established security protocols. We're implementing precautionary restrictions on all of Richard's administrative credentials, he explained after ending the call. This won't be visible to him but prevents any unusual transactions until we resolve the situation. As we continued, reviewing the evidence, Detective James Lawson arrived, a stocky man with the watchful eyes and measured movements of an experienced financial crimes investigator. After brief introductions, he added his own documentation to our growing evidence portfolio. The Boston and Seattle departments have confirmed facial recognition matches from their case files, he informed us, displaying comparison photographs that clearly showed Helena Sullivan's identity progression through her various aliases. We've also verified her continued legal marriage to James Collins through county records in Massachusetts, making the planned ceremony tomorrow legally invalid regardless of other considerations. The comprehensive evidence assembly created a sobering portrait of a sophisticated serial financial predator who had refined her methodology through multiple iterations. What might have seemed isolated incidents when viewed separately formed an undeniable pattern when presented collectively, exactly the approach I had used in building successful fraud cases throughout my career. The most effective intervention point remains the rehearsal dinner, I noted, reviewing our timeline. With all principal parties present, but before the actual ceremony, we minimize both public disruption and potential financial damage. Agreed, Detective Lawson confirmed. I've arranged for additional officers to be positioned discreetly throughout the venue. Given her history of quick departures when confronted, we need to ensure she doesn't simply walk out before formal charges are processed. As we finalized our approach, I received a text message from Richard. Just landed at O'Hare. Heading to hotel soon. Your room is confirmed. Presidential suite on the 32nd floor. See you at dinner. The continued focus on luxury accommodations, a presidential suite for a post-surgery cancer patient who needed no such extravagance, reinforced Helena's priority of maintaining appearances over substance. The excessive gesture likely represented another unauthorized expense from Richard's accounts rather than genuine consideration for my comfort. They'll be arriving soon, I noted, showing the message to our assembled team. Is everyone clear on their positions and timing? With confirmations from all parties, we dispersed strategically throughout the hotel. Nathan and I proceeded to my assigned suite to establish our base of operations, while the compliance officers returned to their office to prepare the necessary financial documentation. Detective Lawson stationed himself in the lobby to monitor arrivals while coordinating with his supporting officers. The presidential suite was indeed lavish, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, multiple rooms, and elegant furnishings that would typically cost thousands per night. The extravagance only reinforced the disconnect between appearance and reality that characterized Helena's entire operation, creating impressive displays funded by other people's resources. At 6:15 p.m., my phone rang with Richard's number. "Mom, we're checked in and getting ready for the rehearsal dinner. Are you settled in your suite?" "Just arrived," I confirmed, maintaining our established communication pattern. "The room is lovely, though unnecessarily elaborate for my needs." "Nothing but the best for my mother," Richard replied with the forced cheerfulness that had characterized his communication since Helena's influence had taken hold. "Heather insisted on the upgrade when she heard about your surgery. The rehearsal dinner starts at 7:30 in the Wellington Ballroom downstairs. Can't wait to see you." After ending the call, I completed my own preparations. Not just the formal attire appropriate for a rehearsal dinner, but also organizing the comprehensive evidence portfolio we would present during our intervention. The timing would need to be precise, balancing the need for privacy with the presence of key witnesses. Nathan returned at 7 p.m. with confirmation that all elements were in place. Detective Lawson has positioned officers at all exits. The compliance team is set up in the manager's office adjacent to the ballroom. The prosecutor has reviewed our final evidence compilation and approved proceeding with the approach we outlined. "And the recovery documentation?" I asked, referencing the financial and legal papers that would be essential for reclaiming stolen assets. "All prepared," he confirmed, patting his briefcase. "The freeze orders, asset tracking documentation, and international recovery filings are ready for immediate implementation. The banking connections have been verified for real-time response once we initiate." At 7:25 p.m., we proceeded downstairs to the Wellington Ballroom where the rehearsal dinner was being held. The elegant space had been transformed with elaborate floral arrangements, custom lighting, and luxury table settings that suggested expenditures far exceeding standard pre-wedding celebrations. Each element reinforced the pattern of excessive spending characteristic of Helena's operations, creating impressive displays using her target's resources. Richard spotted me immediately upon entry, breaking away from a conversation to greet me with a warm but brief embrace. "Mom, you look wonderful. How are you feeling after the surgery?" "I'm managing well," I assured him, noting the genuine concern in his expression despite the artificial circumstances surrounding us. My son was still present beneath the influence Helena had established, a realization that strengthened my resolve to proceed despite the emotional challenges ahead. "Come meet Heather's parents," he urged, guiding me toward an elegantly dressed older couple who projected the polished sophistication of career professionals. "Walter and Margaret Simmons. They flew in from Seattle yesterday." The introduction immediately confirmed another element of Helena's fraudulent construction. These individuals were clearly hired actors rather than actual parents, a tactic she had employed in previous iterations according to Nathan's investigation. Their polished small talk and vague references to our daughter's accomplishments followed established patterns of performative background rather than genuine family history. "Lovely to meet you both," I responded with professional courtesy, making mental notes of specific statements that contradicted known facts about Helena's actual background. Each inconsistency would provide additional evidence for our intervention documentation. As we were seated for dinner, I strategically positioned myself where I could observe both Richard and Helena while maintaining proximity to the side entrance where our intervention team would enter. Helena, resplendent in a designer dress that likely represented another unauthorized expenditure, controlled the room with practiced charm, moving between conversations with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing perceptions. The choreographed nature of the event was striking, from the precisely timed entrance of the wedding party to the carefully scripted toasts that created an impression of long-standing relationships, despite most connections being less than a year old. Helena had constructed an elaborate performance designed to validate her fictional narrative while discouraging critical examination. At precisely 8:45 p.m., as the main course was being served, I nodded subtly to Nathan, our predetermined signal, to initiate the intervention sequence. He discreetly left the table, ostensibly taking a phone call, but actually alerting our coordinated team that we were proceeding as planned. 5 minutes later, the hotel manager approached our table with appropriately apologetic courtesy. "Mr. Winters, Ms. Simmons, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt your celebration, but there's an urgent matter requiring your attention in my office. It will only take a few minutes." Helena's expression flickered momentarily with suspicion, the instinctive wariness of someone who maintains multiple deceptions, before she recovered her composed facade. "Surely whatever it is can wait until after dinner. We're in the middle of our celebration." "I'm afraid it concerns security matters that require immediate attention," the manager insisted with professional firmness. "My office is just down the hall. Your guests can continue enjoying their meal in your brief absence." Richard looked confused but nodded agreeably. "Of course, we'll sort it out quickly." He turned to the assembled guests. "Please continue. We'll be right back." As they rose to follow the manager, I discreetly left through a different exit, taking a service corridor that Nathan had identified during our preparation to reach the manager's office before Richard and Helena arrived. This timing would be critical, allowing me to be present for the intervention without being identified as its source until the appropriate moment. The manager's office had been transformed into an impromptu operational center. Detective Lawson and 2 uniformed officers stood near the door. Howard Brennan and Jennifer Martinez from Wellington Investments were positioned at the conference table with their documentation prepared. Nathan waited beside them with our evidence portfolio organized for maximum impact. When Richard and Helena entered, their expressions shifted from mild annoyance to confusion at the assembled group. "What's going on?" Richard asked, his gaze moving between the unfamiliar faces. "Is there a problem with our event?" Before anyone could respond, Helena's practiced instincts activated. "Richard, this seems inappropriate. Let's return to our guests and have the hotel contact our attorney if there's an actual concern." Her slight step toward the door was subtly blocked by Detective Lawson's positioning, not confrontational, but effectively preventing a quick exit. "Ms. Sullivan," Detective Lawson stated formally, "we need to discuss some concerning financial activities associated with your accounts." The use of her real surname had an immediate impact, a visible flinch that momentarily cracked her composed facade. "My name is Heather Simmons," she corrected with forced confidence. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Helena," I stated calmly, stepping forward from where I had been partially obscured by the door. "Or should I call you Helen Stewart, or perhaps Amanda Phillips or Catherine Morgan?" Richard's expression transformed from confusion to shock as he looked between me and Helena. "Mom, what are you talking about? What is this?" "Your fiancé isn't who she claims to be," I explained gently but firmly. "Her real name is Helena Sullivan, and she's done this before, multiple times, with other men before you." Helena's recovery was impressive, the practiced composure of someone accustomed to managing unexpected challenges to her constructed narratives. "Richard, your mother is clearly confused. Perhaps her medication after surgery has affected her judgment. This is some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake," Detective Lawson interjected, laying out identification documents on the table. "We have confirmed your identity through fingerprint matches with previous cases in Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco. You're still legally married to James Collins of Massachusetts, making tomorrow's ceremony legally invalid regardless of other considerations." As Richard stared at the documents in growing disbelief, Howard Brennan from Wellington Investments stepped forward. "Mr. Winters, we've identified concerning transfers from your personal accounts to offshore holdings controlled by Ms. Sullivan. Approximately $495,000 has been moved through structured transactions over the past 7 months." "That's not possible," Richard protested, though his expression suggested dawning recognition of possibilities he had previously refused to consider. We have some joint accounts for wedding expenses, but nothing of that magnitude. The transactions were executed using your credentials but from devices registered to Ms. Sullivan, Jennifer Martinez explained, displaying the transaction records. The pattern matches known fraud methodologies we're trained to identify. The evidence mounted. Transaction records, identity confirmations, patterns matching previous cases. Helena's demeanor shifted from defensive denial to calculated assessment. Her gaze moved systematically around the room, evaluating potential responses with the efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating detection. "Richard, these people are misinterpreting normal financial activities," she attempted, her tone precisely, calibrated to suggest reasonable explanation. "The transfers were investments we discussed for our future. Everything has been completely transparent, including the $49,850 taken from my cancer treatment fund?" I asked quietly, producing the bank statements documenting the unauthorized wire transfer. "Was that also a transparent investment for your future?" Richard's head snapped toward Helena, genuine shock replacing confusion. "You told me that was being returned immediately. You said it was a temporary emergency measure that had already been reversed." "It was going to be," she insisted, though her response lacked the confident assurance of her previous statements. There were timing complications with the venue payments. Everything was going to be sorted out after the wedding. Nathan chose this moment to present the final, devastating evidence. "We've identified tickets purchased in your real name and that of James Mercer for a flight to Belize departing Sunday morning," he stated, displaying the reservation confirmation. "One-way tickets paid for using funds from Mr. Winters' investment account. Mr. Mercer has been identified as your accomplice in at least 2 previous operations." This revelation appeared to breach Helena's calculated composure. For the first time, genuine alarm showed in her expression, the recognition that her established exit strategy had been discovered and documented. Richard stood motionless, his face reflecting the cascading realizations of betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of shock and dawning anger. "The wedding venue payments that required my mother's medical savings, did they even exist?" "The Wellington Club was paid only their standard deposit of $5,000, Detective Lawson confirmed, referencing his documentation. "Not the $45,000 you were apparently told. Similarly, we've verified most vendor deposits were approximately 1/10 the amounts shown in the documentation Ms. Sullivan provided to you." As the full scope of the deception became clear, Richard turned to Helena with an expression of profound betrayal. "You stole my mother's cancer treatment money for non-existent expenses? Where did it actually go?" Helena's response was not to Richard but to me, her gaze sharpening with recognition of who had orchestrated her exposure. "You did all this," she stated, not as accusation but as professional acknowledgement. "You traced everything." "I'm a forensic accountant," I replied simply. "Following financial deception is quite literally what I did for 40 years before retirement. You took my cancer treatment fund and underestimated who you were stealing from." This revelation seemed to complete Helena's understanding of her miscalculation. She had targeted a family containing precisely the type of professional most qualified to uncover her methodology, mistaking my age and health situation for vulnerability, rather than recognizing the experience and skills that made me particularly dangerous to her operation. "Richard," Detective Lawson stated formally, "we need your statement regarding these unauthorized transfers. Meanwhile, Ms. Sullivan, you're being detained on multiple charges including identity fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Officers, we'll escort you for formal processing." As the uniformed officers moved forward, Helena made one last attempt at manipulation. "Richard, they've misunderstood everything. I can explain all of this. Don't let them do this to us, to our future." But the evidence had accomplished what emotional appeals could not. Richard stepped back, physically and symbolically separating himself from her influence. "I'll be pressing charges for the theft from my accounts," he stated, his voice steady. despite the emotional turbulence evident in his expression, and for stealing my mother's cancer treatment fund. Helena's composed facade finally collapsed completely as she recognized the operation's terminal failure. The officers secured her with professional efficiency, while Detective Lawson read her rights. As she was escorted from the room, she cast one final glance at me. Not with anger, but with a strange professional respect, one specialist acknowledging another's superior execution. In the aftermath of Helena's removal, Richard sat heavily. In the nearest chair, the weight of all he had learned visibly overwhelming him. "Mom, I don't even know where to begin," he said finally, looking up with shame and remorse etched across his features. "The things I said to justify taking your medical fund. I can't believe I did that. You were manipulated by someone who's perfected that skill through multiple iterations," I responded gently, taking the seat beside him. "She selected you specifically because of your professional success and minimal family connections, then systematically isolated you from outside perspectives that might have identified the deception earlier." Howard Brennan approached with composed professionalism. "Mr. Winters, we've already implemented security protocols to prevent further unauthorized transfers from your accounts. The recovery process for the offshore transfers will begin immediately, though some funds may take time to retrieve through international banking systems." Richard nodded numbly, still processing the collapse of what he had believed was his future. "What about the guests? The wedding party? What do I tell everyone?" "The why. Hotel manager is informing guests that an emergency has necessitated postponing tomorrow's events," Nathan explained. "No specific details are being shared at this stage, protecting both the investigation and your privacy." As the immediate crisis response continued around us, financial holds being implemented, statements being recorded, evidence being formally documented, Richard turned to me with the devastating realization that he had nearly lost everything to a predator he had willingly invited into his life. "How did you figure it all out?" he asked quietly. "Even with your background, tracking all this so quickly after surgery seems impossible." "I approached it as I would any complex financial fraud," I explained. "Identified the patterns, documented the evidence, and assembled the necessary resources for effective intervention. The only difference was the personal motivation to protect you rather than simply recovering stolen assets." His eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I had seen from him in months, unfiltered by Helena's influence or social performance. "I took your cancer treatment money," he whispered, horror at his own actions finally breaking through. "What kind of son does that?" "One who was systematically manipulated by a professional predator," I replied firmly. "Helena didn't just target your finances. She deliberately altered your perceptions and values through techniques she's refined across multiple victims. Your responsibility now is not self-recrimination, but recovery, both financial and personal." Over the next several hours, as statements were completed and initial recovery processes implemented, Richard remained in a state of shocked processing, moving between profound remorse, angry realization of how thoroughly he had been deceived, and gradual recognition of the systematic way Helena had separated him from his authentic values and connections. By midnight, the immediate crisis response had transitioned to structured recovery procedures. Detective Lawson confirmed Helena would remain in custody pending formal charges across multiple jurisdictions. The compliance team had secured all accounts and begun documenting transfers for recovery actions. The hotel had discreetly informed guests of the ceremony's cancellation without specific explanations. As we finally returned to my suite, exhausted but with the immediate danger addressed, Richard faced me with the full weight of recognition. "You saved me from financial ruin," he acknowledged quietly. "But more importantly, you saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, someone who could justify stealing his mother's cancer treatment money for a fabricated emergency." "That's what family does," I replied simply. "We recognize what's authentic in each other, even when external influences attempt to override it. In the days that followed, we began the complex process of rebuilding, not just financial recovery, but the more fundamental reconstruction of authentic relationship and values. Richard formally pressed charges against Helena Sullivan, providing comprehensive documentation of unauthorized transfers and fraudulent representations. His full cooperation ensured she would face consequences she had evaded in previous iterations of her scheme. The financial recovery proved more successful than initially anticipated. Nearly 70% of the transferred funds were secured through immediate freezing of identified accounts, with additional recovery expected through international banking cooperation. Richard insisted that the first priority was restoring my medical fund in full, transferring the necessary amount from his remaining assets before any other financial matters were addressed. More meaningful than the financial restoration was the authentic reconnection that emerged from the crisis. As Helena's systematic isolation techniques were identified and dismantled, Richard gradually reconnected with the core values and genuine relationships that had defined him before her influence. Our conversations regained the depth and authenticity that had characterized our relationship before his entry into the financial world that had made him vulnerable to Helena's methodology. 3 weeks after the dramatic intervention, as I was preparing for my first immunotherapy treatment, Richard joined me for a follow-up appointment with my oncologist. His presence wasn't just performative support, but genuine engagement with my medical journey, asking informed questions, taking detailed notes, and committing to being physically present for key treatment milestones despite the professional adjustments this would require. "I've requested a transfer to the Minneapolis office," he informed me as we left the hospital. "It was approved yesterday. I'll be moving back next month." The announcement surprised me, as I had been careful not to pressure him regarding location during our recovery conversations. "Richard, that's a significant change. Are you certain it's what you want rather than what you think you should want after everything that's happened?" His smile reflected genuine consideration rather than reactive decision-making. "I've spent weeks examining what actually matters to me versus what I thought should matter based on external metrics. Being close enough to provide real support during your treatment isn't obligation. It's alignment with my authentic values." This distinction between obligatory response and authentic choice represented perhaps the most significant recovery from Helena's influence. She had systematically targeted his vulnerabilities around external validation and professional identity, gradually replacing authentic values with performance metrics that served her exploitation purposes. 6 months later, as I completed my final immunotherapy treatment with Richard by my side, my oncologist delivered the news we had been cautiously hoping for. "All markers indicate complete response to treatment. We'll continue monitoring, of course, but at this point, I'm comfortable classifying you as in remission." The relief and celebration of this medical victory was magnified by the parallel recovery we had achieved in our relationship. Through the catalyst of crisis, we had reconstructed not just financial security, but the authentic connection that Helena had systematically targeted for exploitation. That evening, as we shared dinner at Richard's new Minneapolis apartment, a modest but comfortable space reflecting more authentic priorities than his previous status-focused residence, raised his glass in a toast that acknowledged both journeys. "To remission and recovery," he offered. "Medical, financial, and personal." I raised my glass in response, adding, "And to the unexpected gift of clarity that sometimes emerges from our greatest challenges." What Helena Sullivan could never have anticipated when targeting our family was that her attempt to exploit vulnerability would ultimately strengthen rather than damage the authentic connections she sought to manipulate. By attempting to separate Richard from his core values and family bonds, she had inadvertently created the circumstances that would lead to their powerful reaffirmation. The woman who stole my cancer treatment fund had intended it as merely one component of a sophisticated financial extraction scheme. Instead, it became the catalyst for exposing her entire operation. while simultaneously rebuilding the authentic relationship with my son that represented the genuine wealth she could never comprehend nor successfully steal. When Helena Sullivan targeted a 72-year-old widow with cancer, she thought she had identified an easy secondary victim to exploit while focusing on her primary financial target. What she couldn't have recognized was that this particular widow possessed exactly the professional skills, methodical approach, and determination required to dismantle her entire operation and protect not just financial assets, but something far more valuable: the authentic connection between mother and son that represented true wealth beyond any account balance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.